Hello, and thank you for joining us for FSK From Home Lecture Series. I am Margot Copera, Public Programs Manager here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today and to those who have donated to our FSK From Home Giving Challenge so far this year. I want to let you all know that we've raised a little over $900 so far with this program today. Thank you for your incredible support. It really makes a difference and a big impact on all of our work that we do here at our institution. Our goal this year for FSK From Home is $3,000 to raise for the season. If you would like to donate during the program, I'm going to put in the donation information and link in the chat today. So let's get started. This spring for our FSK season, we pull back the curtain on our collections. We connect with the MCHC staff and our colleagues as they reveal the stories behind the objects that we preserve, interpret, and display. Today, we will discuss one of the earliest examples of photography present in our collection. Catherine Mayfield, France-Merrick Director of the Furlong Baldwin Library at MCHC, is taking us on a deep dive into our work to preserve more than 300 daguerreotypes. The individual stories behind our daguerreotype collection, the new findings that are being discovered through the conservation process, and the artistic and technical qualities that make our collection unique. So we welcome you today, Kate. Thank you for hosting this conversation today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's program. We are very excited today to, as Margot said, peel back the curtain on our collection of daguerreotypes. So the Maryland Center for History and Culture, between our museum and library, is home to so many treasures in local, state, and national history, from original manuscripts and prints, textiles and costumes, photographic materials, and so much more. So in getting to work with these collections, there are materials that really captivate us through their composition, the processes of their creation, and the stories behind them. We all kind of have our favorites. And daguerreotypes, to me, and I know to so many, are really objects of fascination. They exemplify art and science, and they're evidence of the very beginnings of photography, a medium that has changed our reality and our understanding of the past. And as Margot said, the reason that we are talking about them today in part is that we are undertaking a conservation project of our over 300 daguerreotypes. So conservation of this collection is being supported in part by a federal Save America's Treasures grant, which is administered by the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the National Park Service. We are so grateful for this support. We are a second-time recipient of this grant, having received funding in 1999 for the encasement of our original manuscript of the Star-Spangled Banner. So this is a wonderful grant opportunity. And when it comes to our daguerreotype collection, Maryland has really played a major role in fostering the growth of the photographic medium in US history. So we are very, very excited to be able to conserve this really important collection. So to dive into today's program, I am very happy to introduce you now to our guest, Zach Long. Zach is a photograph conservator at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts in Philadelphia. So working with both institutional and private clients, he performs aesthetic and stabilization treatments on photographs spanning the history of the medium. He's previously held positions at the George Eastman Museum, Harvard University's Weissman Preservation Center, and the Image Permanence Institute. He has a Master of Arts and Certificate of Advanced Study in Art Conservation from SUNY Buffalo State, and a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Photographic Illustration from the Rochester Institute of Technology. Welcome, Zach.
Welcome, or thank you. It's great to be here, Kate. Pleasure to be here. So I'm very excited about this project. It's an a privilege to be able to work with this collection. It's not only is it a ton of daguerreotypes, and having hundreds of daguerreotypes come into the lab is a treat. And there are some very choice images in here. We have some incredibly early images from really the first couple of years of the medium of photography to then spanning out to kind of the whole Daguerrean period, which starts to fade off in the early 1860s. And so it's a great project. Each daguerreotype is a unique image. So these are all unique objects. And so they're very special. So I can give a little background here on the daguerreotype. So daguerreotype is the first practical photographic process. It was announced in 1839, the invention of Louis Daguerre, who's a Frenchman. That's him pictured on the left there in this famous portrait by Spatier Bleu. On the upper right, you'll see the materials for making a daguerreotype. So this is the original Giroux daguerreotype outfit. This was the camera after the daguerreotype process was announced. Giroux made the equipment. Daguerre went into a deal with this company, Giroux. They made the equipment and they actually put a plaque on the side of the camera that had his signature on it, that this was an approved daguerreotype apparatus. The process is a little involved, but so it does take some time to learn it, but it is not overly complex. The basics of it are that you take a plate of copper that has silver clad onto the upper surface of it. You expose that to iodine vapors, creating a silver halide that's sensitive to light, silver iodide. You then expose that in the camera, and then for early on, quite a long period of time, you might be talking 15 minutes to do an exposure. Then after the exposure, you would put it into a mercury development box. So you would actually fume the plate with mercury, and that would develop the image. And then afterwards, you would fix it to wash off the residual silver halides. The plate was very, very fragile, though, extremely fragile, particularly the early plates before they started to gild them, where they would add gold into the chemistry as a final step. These plates were very sensitive to touch and to atmospheric pollutants. It would tarnish very easily. Touch them with your finger, you'd smudge the image off. And so housing them became very, very important. In the bottom right, this is a typical daguerreotype housing. So you have a small case. These were very common in the United States and in England. You then have the daguerreotype plate itself, then a small mat, typically made of brass. They became more ornate as time went on. And then glass, you would then have that bound together with tape, usually gum tape, and then what's called a preserver. It's a thin metal foil would wrap around the outside of that package, and then it would be pushed into the case to try and exclude as much pollutants as possible and to protect the surface from scratches and smudges.
And Zach, sometimes I know that with a case, there are different kinds of cased photographs, and sometimes I think people see a cased image and think, oh, that's a daguerreotype. But can you share a little bit about that you might find different types of items within these cases?
Yeah, so the big three for cased photographs are the daguerreotype, the ambrotype, and to a lesser extent, the tintype. Daguerreotypes can be identified because of that silver surface. It is a polished mirror surface, and it is direct positive. And if you move it around, you can see a reflection in it. It's actually can be quite difficult to actually see a daguerreotype properly. Lighting them for an exhibition is certainly a challenge. But you want to reflect something black off of the surface, or else you're just going to be looking at yourself. The black that's reflecting off of the surface is going to be the shadow areas in there. The highlights are the image particles are actually scattering the light, so that's the highlight. So you're going to if you move this around, the daguerreotype around, you'll see it go from a negative to a positive, And you'll probably be looking at yourself for a good part of that too, until you can get the angle just right. And the cases did evolve over time. They became much more elaborate as time went on. Earlier daguerreotype cases, brass mats are usually fairly simple, and by the time you get into later in the amber types, they start to get a lot of punched in work, a lot of pressed in work, and the brass mats kind of more over the top design starts to come into the cases. And a lot of times the treatments involving a daguerreotype are repair of these cases, which are integral. You know, it's been with the object for over 150 years typically, unless it's been shifted around, but for a very long time. And so it's integral to keep as much of that original materials. It's important to keep as much of that original material as possible. So in the image on this slide, there's a Warren Thompson stereo daguerreotype. So you could have stereo images, 3D images back in the mid 19th century. This is kind of the first 3D stereographs where used daguerreotypes. And then on the right is you're seeing quite a bit of tarnish on this plate, is the passe-partout style housing, which was much more common in continental Europe. And if you look on the left plate of the Warren Thompson, that's a crack in the plate, or a crack in the cover glass. And you can see a dark line of tarnish is formed directly underneath that crack. And that shows you just how sensitive these objects are, or even a crack in the glazing will cause tarnish beneath it from air working its way through that crack, and then you'll end up with silver sulfide, silver oxide forming on the surface. They'll tarnish in a way similar to any antique silverware, antique candlesticks, or they blacken. It's a similar deterioration.
And Zach, so we talked a little bit about not touching fingerprints, the kind of impact that can have on the plates. What are some of the other issues that can really cause conservation problems or deterioration in daguerreotypes?
So one of the big issues is with the glazings themselves, with the cover glasses themselves. So they were originally selected mainly based on what was cost effective, what was relatively optically clear, not on stability. These were soda lime glasses, and they're not particularly stable. And so 100 years, 150 years on, a lot of them are showing deterioration. So on a long enough time scale, with humidity, glass does deteriorate just like a lot of other materials. And so you actually, because of hydrolysis, you'll see corrosion form on the glass. And that can actually, not only does it obscure the image below, such as in the central plate here, that's a kind of extreme case of glass deterioration, but eventually will weep out of the glass and can, if the plate is horizontal, it's on its back, it can actually drop onto the plate itself and start to corrode the plate. So while original, sometimes they're just too deteriorated and they cause too much of a risk. So it can be quite necessary to replace the cover glass. And so a large part of the project, the MCHC project, is going to be replacing these cover glasses, rebinding the daguerreotypes to make them look the way they should, so you can actually see them. So the plate in the middle, once this glass is removed, you'll be able to see the image again, and you can't even see the person's face right now, but you'll be able to. All of that will be revealed. And a lot of times, these older packages, they get dust in there. The velvet that was used as the pinch pad, this little strip that wraps around as a gasket almost, that wraps around the edge of the plate package. That's shedding fibers. The binding tapes themselves fail. A lot of plates have been rebound because people wanted to clean them. And you end up with fibers and detritus, small insects sometimes on the plates. And so there's a lot of reasons to repackage these, and the effects can be quite dramatic. And then further, if it's necessary, we'll go through washing the plates or cleaning the plates. And there are some on the left are
and I know, so how much could be done to kind of bring this back to life. And the other thing that we should say too is that after conservation, the original materials, like that original plate glass, will still be kept with the item because it's still evidence of that history of this item. It might be studied at a future date, so it'll still be maintained with the package.
Yes, it's important to keep all the materials as much as possible in place. You never know what will be used by a researcher in the future. So it's best just to, particularly at an institution, it's very simple just to package it all together in a 4-flap and send it back that way.
And then, Zach, the image on the right is an interesting one, right? Sorry, Margot, if we can go back one slide. There we go. This is by the Langenheim brothers. And so they were one of the first very successful commercial photographers in the United States. They were born in Germany and in 1807 and 1809, respectively, and they immigrated to the United States as young men. They had opened a studio in Philadelphia, and they had many prominent United States people sit for them, including President John Tyler and others. So that's quite an interesting one within the collection.
Yes, and the case is interesting as well, and the mat. So and it has this paper mat, which is fairly unique. Usually you do almost always see brass mats. Earlier plates, sometimes paper, but most often brass. And the case itself, you can't see it, but in this image, but on the cushion, which lines the lid of the case, it's a little pad. It actually have their name embossed in the velvet of the cushion. So it's often very hard to determine who took a daguerreotype. And so this is one of the few instances, thankfully, because of their branding, basically, of the case, that we were able to was able to see and know who actually took the plate. You also will see sometimes on the brass mats, stamped into the brass mats, you'll see names. So, and it is a very well done portrait. So they were definitely skilled photographers.
Yeah, and that is really interesting, Zach, too, about that point about the identifications, where it's different with print photographs, often where we see a lot of handwriting on the backs of them. And so when we have provenance, a history of ownership that's passed down and where that kind of information has been recorded, that is really valuable, as well as sometimes what you see within these cases is a little slip of paper, and that can provide evidence of the identities and sometimes other information as well. So that is always a joy to find.
So these are some beautiful plates in the collection. This collection has amazing hand coloring, some of the best hand coloring I've seen. One of the negative aspects of previous cleaning treatments was that a lot of times they were done despite hand coloring. So if you wanted to remove tarnish, to do that, to do these baths, these cleaning baths that were common in the 19th century and in the 20th century, earlier 20th century, they would dip them in potassium cyanide. They would use basically just commercial silver cleaners or similar products similar to that, and you would remove all of the hand coloring off the plate. And so you may have removed the tarnish, but you've also now totally changed how it appears. It's like similar to stripping the paint off of marbles. So here we have MCHC is very lucky in that a lot of these plates have not been cleaned or messed with in the past. And so we're finding a lot of original binding tapes and these just fantastic examples of hand coloring. So one of the colors you don't usually see a lot is these like pale yellows for a dress. And this portrait on the left is just this amazing yellow dress that this young woman is in. And it really changes by how you turn it, because again, how you look at the plate, it's going to keep changing. It's not like looking at a print. You can just move it a little bit and you'll see that dress kind of go from this kind of grayish yellow to a bright yellow as it comes in. You're really seeing the pigment that they've applied to the surface. of the plate. And these are very just really underbound. They're not, it's not like a thick paint layer. It's very light, just enough to adhere the pigment to the plate surface. And the middle plate is similar, just another great example of really detailed, well executed hand coloring. What you typically find on daguerreotypes, what's the most common hand coloring would be a little bit of red in the cheeks for men and women, all ages, a little red in the cheeks, and then they would usually, with a little bronze powder, would highlight jewelry that the person was wearing. So, and there are some good examples of that in this collection too. There's even one person who's wearing a signet ring, and they even have the jewel on the ring, this little pinky ring, hand colored in. So a lot of amazing images. And again, the cases themselves too. This is on the far right is a case that's been hand painted, and it has this inlaid mother of pearl decoration. And so there's a lot of nice union cases for in the later period. Union case is a early plastics, early thermoplastic. They look black, typically are black, and it's actually shellac is the main component of it, shellac and wood flour. And then just a wide variety of the traditional American cases where you see these, bright purples, bright blues, these colors that you don't associate with the 19th century. You think of everyone in drab, Victorian black, but there is a lot of bright colors back then. Sometimes you'll open a daguerreotype case and you'll be just struck with the most vibrant blue that is amazingly not faded over the last 170 years. So they're incredible, and they're just fun to look at, even if you don't think about the history of them, just visually it's a treat.
So we're gonna look at some of the stories behind the images within our collection, as well as continue to talk about conservation. So these are really incredible images here. This woman on the left is Martha Ann Adavis. There was, in the daguerreotype package, there was a identification here, a slip of paper that reads Martha Ann Adavis, generally known as Patty. So what we're looking at here is a daguerreotype image on the left and a tintype image on the right. And speak a little bit more about those differences in just a little bit, but wanted to tell you a little bit about Patty. So what we know is that she was born into slavery, and she was the property of a man named William McCubbin, who was a Baltimore resident. He died in 1839, and she was sold by McCubbin's widow to Dr. John Whitridge, also of Baltimore. She was about 23 years old at the time. So Dr. Whitridge was a Harvard-educated physician, and so Patty lived with him, his wife, and his children, including the child that is seen on the right here. She was originally identified as Alice, but what's interesting about, one of the things that's interesting about this is that there is a daguerreotype of this same image on the right, and that is not in our collection. It's actually owned by a private collector, Ross Kelbaugh. He is a wonderful, invaluable resource into Maryland photographic history, and we will share more about some of his books and works a little bit later. But he does own the daguerreotype of this image on the right. And that daguerreotype did have an identification of the young girl as Anna. Anna and Alice were very close in age. They were about 2 years apart. But so that's kind of an interesting example of how more information comes to light over time. So this image is so very striking. And there's, we know a lot of backstory about it, but beyond that, just in examining the images themselves, there's so much that you can, I think, read into them. So the images alone tell us that she was beloved. Her photo was taken multiple times and it was copied, so there were these 2 different daguerreotypes taken at on different days. She's wearing different clothing here. We know that there was at least one copy and that there's the tintype. And Zach, can you speak to that idea of a copy from a daguerreotype?
Yeah, so because daguerreotypes were a unique image, it was direct positive. So what you're looking at was actually in the camera, in the room with the person facing them. So in this case, Martha Adavis, this plate was in the room with her, and it was right there. It wasn't a negative, there's no negative. And because of that, there's no reproductions, there's just multiples. If you want two daguerreotypes, or you want a daguerreotype replicated, if you want two of the same image, you have to rephotograph the daguerreotype. So you have to pin it up on a wall and then take another daguerreotype of it. And there are examples of this in the collection where you usually can see the edges of them, or you'll see part of a case. But it was very hard to share photographs back then. And so you do see, very hard, I should just say, to share images. There was no easy reproduction method. And so you would see copies of paintings, you would see copies of daguerreotypes. The tintype is interesting. The tintype copy is interesting because it came probably 15 years to 2 decades after the daguerreotype was made. So the tintype process didn't come until after the daguerreotype had faded away. And so this wasn't done at the same time. This is someone who went back and said, oh, I really like this image. I want a copy of it and to share. And so they would have gone back at that time and used the prevailing process of that time. This might have been probably from the 1860s. Tintypes were around for a long time. So on the early end would have been the 1860s, 1870s, and had the reproduction made. And what's interesting in looking at these two, stylistically, you can see how they're housed is very different. And this is kind of the evolution of plate package housings. And so on the left, you see it's very plain, brass mat, simple octagon, and there's no preserver. On the right, you have this ornate embossed preserver, this ornate embossed brass mat, so that's very much a later style. So it's interesting to compare them in that way. So you can just say by that alone that they're from different eras. But the fact that it says something about the family dynamic here, and that the child was not photographed by themselves or in some way that would have hid the person. So looking at the right plate, you can see exposure times are still very, very slow, or were very slow throughout the entire Daguerrean era. So you can see the child has moved their arm, and you get this blur from Anna moving her arm because of the exposure was so long, probably a couple seconds. And this is a real problem for people to sit still in bright light for even even 30 seconds, but to talk about 5 minutes, I mean, it's grueling. You see early daguerreotype portraits, people with their eyes closed, people are making squinted faces. They even used to color the glass in daguerreotype studios blue to help so people wouldn't strain their eyes so much because the plates are only sensitive to blue and the ultraviolet. And there were all sorts of props. So there had special chairs to hold people so it would brace their body a little bit. There were headstands which clamp the back of your neck to hold you in place. And for kids, there were some really, medieval torturous looking devices where you would actually clamp your child in place, clamp your baby in place for the picture. I can't imagine doing that. One of the other things that was done occasionally was they would have the child held by either a caretaker or the mother, and they would drape the person holding them in a dark cloth. It's called the hidden mothers. So they focus just on the child. And so the fact this is really a group, this is the picture on the left or the right is really a portrait of both of them. It's not just one doing something mechanical, just holding the child. It's a group picture.
Right. Yeah. Zach, and I noticed somebody mentioned that in the chat too. Just that idea of it really does say a lot. It was not an inexpensive process to have a daguerreotype photo taken. I know we were looking at some of the price ranges. It could be anywhere from maybe $15 to $20 up to $50, depending on the size of the plate. So that's for a single image. So that's quite a lot. We know other things about her relationship, Patty's relationship with the family. When she died, she was buried in the family plot in Baltimore's Greenmount Cemetery. Her tombstone read, Patty Ann Atavis, a faithful and devoted nurse in the family of Dr. John Whitridge for over 36 years. And so there's a lot of information there, but there's also more even behind this story. And this is thanks to other documents that exist. And these are documents that we have in the collection at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. There are, in the collection of the husband of one of the Atavis children, there are papers that indicate that include actually her bill of sale, as well as a will from the Whitridge family. So this documentation, while we see all these family connections, this accompanying documentation also really serves as this evidence of the institution of slavery. So the auction package included documentation saying the bill of sale in 1839, when her original owner, McCubbin, passed away, his property was appraised, including Patty. And she was appraised at, her value was set at about $180. And the bill of sale, when McCubbin's wife sold her to the Whitridge family, it identified her as a slave for life, quote unquote. And she was sold for $200. So it's very, very powerful, this story and all the ways that these pieces come together, what it tells us about her life, about her relationship with the family, as well as just that strong reminder that of this institution and the commodification of people's bodies. So it's quite a powerful, these two images are quite powerful ones. And we will continue on. So this next image is a really unique one as well within our collection. Well, I should say unique in terms of this image and a few others that were taken about at the same time are unique Baltimore views. They're what we know as the earliest Baltimore views. And there's actually a series of 4 of these that appear to be panoramic images where the photographer, who was Henry H. Clark, moved around the Baltimore Harbor and taking these different images. And there's a lot that we can see in this. There's evidence of kind of the industry in Baltimore. You can see there's shipbuilding that is happening in the foreground. There's a shipyard there. We know what some of the ships here are in the image. At the center is the ship called the Tennessee. In the background is a ship called the Philadelphia, and to the right is the Osiris. And so these are really unique in terms of them being whole plate daguerreotypes. So can you speak a little bit to different plate sizes and their kind of rarity?
Yes, so the largest standard plates, the whole plate, is 8.5 by 6.5. And all the smaller plates were cut up as divisions of this. So you would have quarter plates and half plates, 6 plates, 9th plates. And so all the sizes of daguerreotypes are based on cutting up, dividing one of these full plates. Occasionally, they're very rare, but you would see what are called mammoth plates, where there would be some gigantic daguerreotype that would be much larger. But for the most part, whole plate is the largest you come across. They're incredible. The amount of detail that is in here. The daguerreotype has very fine resolution, the process. So you can zoom into these pictures and see and read the side of text on a building. You can really the amount of detail is incredible when you really focus in on these things. You can put them underneath a microscope and really start to explore what Baltimore looked like 170 years ago, in the mid-19th century. And so they're incredible historical documents, and landscape views are actually quite rare. And so when you have a daguerreotype of a landscape of a city, it's often the first image of that city. So they're just exceptional pieces for the history of any place. So they're really, it's just incredible. And if it does form a panorama, I mean, that's even, daguerreotype panoramas are very rare. They're often multiple plates, so it would make sense, it would be in line with that they would could be pieced together to form an even larger view.
That's an incredible image. There's much, as you said, that you can see in the background that you can kind of pull out of this image. At the center in the background is the Washington Monument, which is in the Mount Vernon neighborhood. We have another image of that coming up. You can see also in the background the dome of the Baltimore Cathedral, which is now the Basilica of the Assumption. And there's more. I'm going to show you next another daguerreotype from Clark. So this is a different view, one right in the city on Baltimore Street. And this is right at the bottom right. The sort of plinth that you see there is the Marsh Market Fountain. And this was a public drinking fountain. You could dip a kind of a ladle in to get water there. And this shows a section of Baltimore's one of the primary commercial avenues here. There were a number of photographic studios on this street. And you can see in the background are various businesses. There's a lottery dealer, C.M. McDonald and Company. There was a company called Kidd and White, which was confectioners and fruiterers. And this image, or the spot from where this image would have been taken and where the monument, where the fountain is right now, ended up becoming an extension of the Maryland Institute. So that does not exist anymore, but it's a great early image of providing some evidence of this commercial area. And
you can see too that when you're photographing, because that's long exposure time, whenever you photograph a street scene, people are bustling around, they're not sitting still. So the only people you actually end up capturing are people who are either at some form of leisure or sitting down, leaning up against something. And so you get basically blurs, basically on the sidewalks, on the streets from carriages going by. And you'll find, like in this plate, there's someone leaning up against a lamppost as the only person you can actually see. So it's very interesting in that standpoint. The first person actually captured by a photograph is getting their shoes shined in a street scene.
Another really interesting thing about this image too, and just thinking about the Baltimore photography scene, was that there was a lot of competition, and you can see this in some Ross Kalba's scholarship in his Directory of Baltimore Daguerreotypists, that the newspapers really show how the photographers had to make themselves stand out in different ways through their advertising and through records in the papers, where they would tout their bright studios or the way that they were able to capture daguerreotypes within only a few minutes, and that it would be a smooth and easy process. And so they really had to market themselves to stand out from that competition that existed.
Yeah, getting your portrait taken in this time period was not always an enjoyable experience. Studios, because they needed so much light, were usually at the top floor. If you were in a major city, they were the top floor of a building. So this meant walking up maybe several flights of stairs to then sit in a room that was very hot during the summer in full sunlight and smelled of chemistry. It was just not what we think of as a relaxed sitting experience.
And Zach, so looking at this image too, there's tape on the outside of this. What is that about? And this sort of mat around the image.
Yeah, so there's some odd things going on with these Clark plates. They were treated at some point in time previously. I'm guessing by the materials used, maybe the 90s, 80s. Could have been a little bit earlier than that. Some of them appear to have been cleaned previously, and they all have this packaging where this one's particularly strange, where they've actually masked out part of the image with a piece of paper with the brass mat overlying it. So that's very strange. Then there's Japanese paper with a polyvinyl acetate adhesive, it appears to be, as the binding tape. So definitely not original presentation. These were probably framed. So it's a bit of a mystery, and I'm very, very curious to open these up to do the rebinding of them, because I think I'm going to find something like, well, hopefully it won't be terrifying, but there's going to be something interesting back there, just based on the materials that were used here. Yeah, because there's been this long history of daguerreotypes being cleaned. You sometimes find some rather unusual ways of putting the packages back together and designing the packages over the years. And I should say that cleaning daguerreotypes chemical cleaning daguerreotypes is definitely not something to take lightly. A lot of damage has been done over the years, over the decades, by cleaning these plates. And so, if it was cleaned with cyanide, can be really damaging to the image. The thiourea cleaners that became popular in the mid 20th century, those they thought were great, and then they realized they caused a bunch of brown spots to form and other issues called measles. And so really nowadays we get away from chemical cleaners. We don't do anything that aggressive, and just try to preserve these images as they are.
That's right. So sometimes there's been really good intentions behind these attempts, but the message is don't attempt to clean on your own. And we spoke earlier about another image of the Washington Monument. So this is a half plate daguerreotype, and it's attributed possibly to John Plum Jr. or to one of his operators. Plum, similar to Brady, operated a number of studios, and he was a photographer who had interest in capturing landmarks and monuments. So there's some evidence that this might have been him due to the existence of several what's called plumeotype views. These are lithographic reproductions of the Washington Monument, taken from a different viewpoint though. And he also did a half plate image of another major public memorial, the Battle Monument. That image is housed in the collection of the Library of Congress. So this is quite an interesting view for us at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, because this is our neighborhood in Baltimore, the Mount Vernon neighborhood. So there are some buildings that we've been able to identify here. What's called the Howard House is on the right. This is where Francis Scott Key passed away. He had married into the Howard family. The Tiffany Fisher House is on the far left, and there's a house called the Greenway House towards the center there. So construction of this monument began in 1815 and was completed by 1829. So we've been able to date this to about circa 1845 due to when we know Plum was operating and what we know about kind of the development of the neighborhood. So we will, and I know Zach mentioned this before, but again, these landscapes are, even though you're seeing a number of them from us, in general, they are very rare. Portrait photography for daguerreotypes was much more common. I know that we want to be able to get to some question and answer, so we're just going to move through some of our next slides pretty quickly. This slide is just an example of how the collection houses a number of portraits of people who were wealthy, who had prominent positions in different ways, and that is partly due to the cost of the daguerreotypes again, as well as whose stories were collected over time, and whose objects were. So on the left is Jerome Napoleon Bonaparte. He was the son of Betsy Bonaparte, also known as Elizabeth Bonaparte, Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte was her full name. And he was the son of Betsy and Jerome Bonaparte, who was the brother of Napoleon Bonaparte. So Betsy and Jerome were married for a very short time. The marriage notoriously was not approved by Jerome's brother, Napoleon. They were eventually divorced. The marriage was annulled. And after Betsy gave birth to this Jerome in London, they came back to Baltimore. And we have a number of Bonaparte items within the collection. On the right is a daguerreotype of Commodore Joshua Barney, who was involved in the Navy. And what's interesting about this is that he passed away in 1818. He had been involved in the War of 1812, and because he passed away in 1818, we know photography wasn't invented until 1839. So this is not clearly an original photograph. Zach, can you share a little bit about this one?
Yeah, so again, you could, at this time period, it was very hard to share images, particularly if you were in geographically distant areas. Family was spread out. And so it's, well, not super common. It is, you do see these daguerreotype pictures of paintings, and they'll, you know, pull close up in, or of miniatures. And it's just a means of reproducing them. They didn't have other options. The only other option for a photograph at this point in time would have been a salt print, and that, you know, those didn't nearly have as much detail, and weren't very popular in this country at that time. So daguerreotype was really your option, and you could elaborate on. Obviously, they're monochromatic, so if you're photographing a painting, you're getting a very different appearance, and so then they've, in this case, gone back and tried to really embellish the image with all this hand coloring and all this applied gold coloring to really make this at least somewhat comparable to the original, and whether it was used by relatives who were moving to a different area and wanted some connection to Barney, or because he was very well known, very important person, if it was going to, you know, an institution or something like that, to have a record of what he looked like. Because again, you couldn't just send someone a picture, you couldn't just make another print. You had to go through this whole laborious process of getting the copy, taking it to the studio, getting the copy.
Exactly. And so, Margot, we'll go to the next slide. And so this image here is just an example of what we're doing right now. Is we are item by item researching behind the images and trying to find what we can about identifications and more beyond just a simple name. Sometimes, especially with women, this can be really difficult, where a woman might not be mentioned or identified by her full name. She might be identified by her husband's name. So we tried to delve into this story, and Elizabeth Brown Edmonds was married to a man named Alexis Caswell, who was a professor. He ended up being the president of Brown University for a number of years. His sort of specialty was mathematics and natural philosophy, astronomy, especially astronomy. There's quite a lot about him, but not so much about her. We've delved into some of the census records, and you know, when there's kind of an absence of detail, we also try to VP of collections about this one, where we're looking at the clothing that she was wearing. And she was able to provide a lot of great information here. Just by looking at what she was wearing, she was saying the bodice here on this is very short, and that was not so typical for the 1840s. It's more of an 1850s kind of style. The black shawl that she's wearing was very common in the middle 19th century. It was a useful accessory. And so due to some of those details, we're able to kind of place this in the early 1850s. So we're trying to do this process item by item through the collection. and hope to be able to share back a lot more by the end of this project. And then we'll go to the next slide, which is, this is a really striking portrait of Jeremiah and Venus Tilghman. So this was a couple who were enslaved. They were owned by Colonel Benedict William Hall of Utah Farm. Hall had extensive land holdings in Harford County and along Herring Run in Baltimore, and over 20 enslaved men and women worked on his estates. So there's been archaeological work that's been done at Herring Run in recent years, and you know that there was an area that is thought to have been identified as the living quarters of Venus and Jeremiah Tilghman. There is not a whole lot more information that we've been able to find on them, but I think this is part of that power, that huge power of photographs and daguerreotypes is in creating this record, that they do live on in this image. And I still hope to find more information about them. And the other thing I wanted to note about this is this was an item that was more recently conserved. And so you can still see this tarnish here. And Zach, so what can you expect after conservation?
Yeah, so in this case, the treatment involved, well, it was mainly addressing the housing itself. And so the case had a torn hinge, which is a very common problem. Those thin leather hinges on old daguerreotype housings frequently are torn. I'd say almost half the time are torn. And the glazing, this was not the original glazing on this plate. It had been rebound previously. It had some dirt that had gotten into the package, and it was the old soda lime glass glazing. So that causes, it's like the green glass you see on a picture frame sometimes. It has that high iron content, gives it a green cast. So not great, not very stable. And so that was replaced out too, given the importance of this plate. And it was all rebound up and repackaged. And so more subtle in this case, definitely a conservative treatment. And so the tarnish is left as it is. It's not obscuring their faces, so why cause the other extra intervention? And that's all it really needed. It was just to clean it up. You get rid of the dust, you'll reduce the amount of corrosion spots that may form down the line. And so when we're going to be treating all of these plates, we're really being we're only washing plates that really need it. So ones that are really have obscuring tarnish or have detritus on the surface of the plates. It's mainly going to be rehousing them, getting new glazings behind there, so you don't have to look through glass deterioration. So you don't have to worry about further tarnish, improving the seals on the plates. All of that is going to help them be preserved for the future. So it's as much about maintaining their current appearance as it is about improving the appearance.
Okay, and the next slide.
Yes. So there's some unique, a few unique items in the collection, or fairly rare items. So on the far left is a Henry Fitz Jr. daguerreotype. This is an ungilded daguerreotype, very early. Henry Fitz Jr. opened what was probably the first daguerreotype studio in Baltimore in 1840. It only lasted a short period of time. He's very important in the history of photography, particularly in America. His self-portrait is one of the earliest daguerreotypes, one of the earliest daguerreotype portraits of an American in the country. And this studio he operated from 1840 to 42. And so these are some of the earliest photographs of Baltimore residents. And it's in this very unique housing. And so this one is actually stamped on the brass mat, Henry Fitz Jr. And then there's another plate that came in that is unfortunately in very, sad state of deterioration, very tarnished. But it is in also this very unique case with a textile on the cushion and this brass mat, which is quite unique. And that, I would say with some certainty, although it's not stamped on the brass mat, is quite possibly another Henry Fitz Jr. daguerreotype. It's a 9th plate. It is ungilded. Someone has, unfortunately, touched the surface of the plate and caused a smudge in the sitter's face. And while this plate may look entirely lost to the average person, imaging technology is advancing, making incredible advances, and there are things that we can now do, very high-tech ways of imaging a plate, elemental mapping. You can actually see an image that appears entirely covered over by corrosion. There's been some interesting work that was done in collaboration with Cornell using a synchrotron to do high-resolution elemental mapping, where they mapped out where the mercury was. So the image in the daguerreotype is silver and mercury amalgam. They mapped out where the mercury was, and you could see the image that was completely hidden by tarnish, or nearly entirely hidden by tarnish. So while this plate will not be cleaned because it is ungilded, which would be very, very risky, probably certain destruction, it will be rehoused to try and prevent the corrosion from getting worse. And maybe at some point down the line, technology, science will advance where this can be imaged and you can see this photograph again. Because again, it is exceptionally early. And then on the right, this is just some a unique binding style that is a little curious, where they've covered the entire back of the plate with the binding paper, opposed to just doing the perimeter. So that's a bit of a mystery. We'll see if more of those show up.
Okay, so Margot, if we can go through the rest. So just wanted to quickly say that after this conservation project is done, a couple of the things that we'll be doing is, well, during the project, all of the images are going to be photographed, and we'll be making those available online through our digital collections. We'll be creating records for all of those using the information that we've learned from this research project, and we'll be later exhibiting as well. And then just wanted to share a few quick resources. Marco, if you could move that. So we will, there's a couple things here for you to take note of, great options for learning more. Zach, if you want to.
Yeah, so I just want to mention the Daguerrean Society, which is a collecting group that is kind of the preeminent collecting group for daguerreotypes and early photographs. They have some great resources out there on their website, and they have a journal as well and an annual conference. If you're interested more in preservation, this is the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, where I work in Philadelphia. We do have a lot of resources on our website, and where we offer preservation advice, and obviously you can send stuff for treatment. The American Institute for Conservation, if you're looking for a conservator, this is kind of our the large group in the United States. Most trained conservators belong to this group, and so that's, you can look find a conservator through that resource. The Photographic Materials Group is a subgroup of the AIC that all the very few amount of photograph conservators in the United States generally belong to. And then the Image Permanent Institute, which is part of the Rochester Institute of Technology, and they have many great resources out there. One in particular that's great for identification is graphicsatlas.org. It's a website where they really go into details of great imaging of how you can identify and learn some more of the history of the various photographic processes.
So I just wanted to mention there's some other wonderful resources to check out if you're interested in learning more about daguerreotypes. And I know I mentioned Ross J. Kelbaugh, who again has contributed so much to the Maryland scholarship about daguerreotypes and early photographic history here in Maryland. He has a new book series out, Black Lives in Focus. You can find that book, you will be able to find that book through our bookstore at the MCHC as well as online. And his books are also available through Amazon. So those are really incredible resources. And I know we've gone over a little bit, but if you have some questions, we could love to answer these. So let's see. I'm going to go to our list here. One here is, Zach, how much time does it take to restore an image and its case?
It depends on the level of damage, but a number of hours, usually a handful of hours. If you send something in for treatment to a conservation lab, though, I would say anticipate anywhere from 3 to a year, 3 months to a year for return, just because conservation labs generally try and have a backlog. And so you're not going to get a fast turnaround.
And then, Zach, if you don't have the picture in a frame or if you don't have it in a case, how do you protect the print?
Oh, well, be very careful with it. First of all, if it is a daguerreotype, they're very sensitive. I would, you can look into having it rebound. You can send it to a photographic conservator. That would probably be the safest route to go. If it's not a high value image, there are resources probably you can find through the Daguerrean Society for how to make simple packages. But you basically want to have it between glass, but not have the glass directly in contact with it.
Okay, so I think that you've mentioned some resources for conservation. The time frame for ambrotypes that came right after daguerreotypes. What were those years that those were popular?
1860s, Civil War era, basically think of it. It wasn't popular. Ambrotypes weren't popular for a particularly long period of time. There's some variety. I think the earliest ones, I want to say late 1850s.
Okay. We have a question about, are there concerns about chemicals in the daguerreotypes as you're handling and conserving them? So sounds like chemicals within the daguerreotypes themselves, and any advice for people that might have their own small collection? Yes,
you do have to worry about cyanide, actually, cyanide residues. So definitely wear gloves. Many daguerreotypes were electroplated. Cyanide can be introduced in that process. The old cyanide cleaning, that can bring cyanide in, and cyanide fixing. So there could be cyanide residues on the plate. And so definitely you always want to handle a daguerreotype regardless of that with gloves on. But nothing that's going to jump off at you, and you don't have to worry about the mercury evolving off and breathing that in.
Someone asked that many years ago they were living in Philadelphia and came upon a small ring with a family crest on the front and several tiny, they were told they were tintype pictures inside, like a mini photo album, and was wondering, is this common in this area, and would these pictures have been tin that small? So it sounds like tintypes in a ring, potentially.
Tintypes can be made very, very, very small. And so I've worked on ones that are, small buttons that are only the size of like a quarter. And so, yeah, it's simple enough to cut it into any size you want. They were probably taken, they might have been on a larger plate and then cut down though. You don't, not necessarily because it's so hard to manipulate something that small. Probably wasn't taken in the camera that way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm sorry to jump in. We are over our time, although we all are just so very interested in learning a little bit more. Everyone out there that is still watching, we will follow this program up with more resources in an email in the coming weeks. We send out an email to you with the program recording, and we will also include all of these resources that Zach and Kate have spoke about today, and also answer some of your other questions as far as resources are concerned. So don't worry. I know we didn't get to all of our questions today, but I wanted to thank you so much, Zach, for joining us and working with us here at MCHC. And Kate, thank you for driving this conversation today. And I hope you had a great time and learned a lot. Really, the chat was, we could answer still a lot more questions. So Thank you all for joining us and for donating and for participating in our program. And we'll see you at our next FSK, our last one for the spring season, in May. So thank you again. Thank you, Kate and Zach, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.